Welcome back to Griffonomics, where we conduct financial investigations to define the risk before we look at the reward. Today, we're diving into the overall energy investment thesis, driven by the colossal AI and data center build-out currently reshaping global industry.
Yeah, it's a really essential topic right now because, you look at the markets and there's this huge, almost euphoric excitement, this momentum around AI. But when you actually peel back the layers, look at the physical infrastructure needed, well, there's some extreme fragility there, huge risks. So our mission today really is to cut through the noise, look past the software, past the chips, and find those durable, physical assets, the actual, picks and shovels that can solve the real structural bottlenecks threatening this whole tech revolution.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack that structural problem first.
Yeah.
We need to define what some are calling the AI power crisis, or the gigawatt imperative. Because this isn't just about faster cloud storage anymore, is it? It feels like it's becoming almost an existential economic thing.
That's exactly the shift. AI development, it's now seen globally as, well, essential for keeping modern economic growth going. Think about it. Aging populations, shrinking workforces in big economies, manufacturing, logistics, healthcare. AI is seen as the tool needed to augment that. The economic push is so strong that the investment, public or private, it's basically become inelastic.
And the critical thing, translating that digital need into just brute force demand for electricity.
Mm-hmm.
That's the rise of these really autonomous AI agents, right?
Precisely, yeah. We're moving beyond, simple chatbots. We're talking sophisticated AI agents. They can do complex reasoning, learn iteratively, self-correct. An AI agent trying to achieve a goal.
Yeah.
It doesn't just sit there waiting for the next prompt. It runs simulations, critiques its own attempts, keeps iterating. And that constant complex reasoning, it demands continuous, intense 24/7 compute power. That's where you get this massive, truly inelastic demand for firm, reliable power.
Okay, inelastic demand, meaning price becomes almost secondary. If a company needs, say, 100 megawatts for its AI model, it's going to pay, well, almost whatever it takes. We've heard figures over $100 per megawatt hour.
Yeah, and that premium pricing, it's actively reshaping the industrial landscape already. The big hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they're competing so hard for power now that the cost of electricity is becoming a major competitive factor. We've seen reports, for instance, where they're effectively pricing out huge traditional industrial users. Think about aluminum smelting, like Alcoa, super energy intensive. They just can't compete on energy costs anymore.
Wow.
It's basically an energy price war. And the tech companies, they're winning because the return on investment for AI is just so much higher than for making, raw commodities.
That really puts it in perspective. And
Yeah.
the scale of this demand, it's forcing us to change how we even talk about it, moving from megawatts MW to thinking in gigawatts GW. So what does this future demand look like quantitatively?
The jump in scale is. It's incredibly fast. Just a couple of years back, landing a single 200 megawatt site, that was a huge deal for a cloud provider now. The hyperscalers are chasing multi-gigawatt deals, GW plural. We're seeing commitments that are just mind-blowing, like the Microsoft-backed Stargate program. They've publicly stated a goal of securing a massive 10 GW of power.
10 gigawatts. And let's just ground that 1 GW figure again for everyone listening. That's not a typo.
No, not at all. It's the new baseline, really. A single large data center campus can now pull up to 1 GW of power, which is roughly enough electricity for, 1 million average American homes?
1 million homes for one campus?
Yeah. And put that in the national context. Total U.S. data center power use is projected to jump from maybe 2% of all U.S. electricity back in 2020 to potentially 12% by 2028.
12%.
We're basically talking about adding the power demand equivalent of several new megacities in just 4 years.
That aggregate demand is huge, but the thing that really blows my mind is the density of power needed inside these buildings. You mentioned something like 100x increase in density per rack in less than a decade.
Yeah, this is the really critical factor driving the physical infrastructure needs. So back in 2020, an NVIDIA Ampere system that needed maybe 10 kilowatts, 10 kW per server rack. By 2022, their Hopper system pushed that to around 40 kW. Now, look ahead to projections for the next generation, like the 2028 Rubin Ultra architecture. They're suggesting it could need upwards of 1,000 kW.
1,000 kW.
A full megawatt.
1 megawatt in a single server cabinet. What does that even mean physically? How do you cool that?
Well, that's the problem. It means an absolutely enormous thermal load, so much heat. The heat density makes traditional air cooling almost impossible. It basically mandates these expensive, complex liquid cooling systems. So now it's not just an electricity supply problem. It's a massive heat rejection problem, too. which means you need huge amounts of water, specialized cooling infrastructure. It just adds another big layer of capital expenditure, logistical complexity for the data center builders. And right now, no software trick can offset that raw hardware power hunger.
Okay, so we have this huge inelastic demand layering onto a grid that's already, frankly, pretty strained. I mean, the U.S. grid needs to add something like 80 GW of new generation capacity every year just to keep up with general electrification, population growth, replacing old plants.
That's the structural nightmare, exactly. Last year, I think we added maybe 50 gigawatt total. We're already falling behind on just baseline needs. And now this AI boom is layering on potentially another 80 to 90 gigawatt of dedicated demand by 2030 by some estimates. The power plants, the new transmission lines, they're just not getting built fast enough, period. And this acute bottleneck means we need solutions that can deploy relatively fast today, not 10 years from now.
Right, which sets up our first big section perfectly. Time horizon is everything here. Big nuclear projects are a decade plus out, and a major new transmission line takes, 8 years minimum? We need reliable, firm power now, and the consensus seems pretty clear. Natural gas is the immediate short-term bridge fuel.
It really has to be nat gas. It's the main scalable, near-term answer for baseload power for this AI revolution. It's simply the quickest option we have right now to deploy large-scale, firm, and importantly, dispatchable power. Power you can turn on when you need it. Compared to the decade-plus lead times for nuclear or those complex transmission buildouts. Gas plants, especially if they can tap into existing pipelines, are the fastest path, even though they still take time, of course.
And it's already a huge part of the system, which must give it an advantage.
Oh, absolutely. It's already providing around 40% of all U.S. power generation. And that share looks set to rise, frankly, because it's the default solution for grid stability. It's reliability, the ability to fire it up quickly and run continuously. That's key. We're even seeing big integrated energy companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron. They're actively planning to build dedicated gas-fired power plants, maybe paired with carbon capture, specifically to power data centers directly, basically bypassing the utility bottleneck.
Okay, bypassing the utility bottleneck. That brings us to this strategic trend of operating behind the meter. Why are data centers doing this? Why avoid the public grid?
Because they just can't afford the timeline risk of relying on the traditional utility. Utility planning cycles are slow, they're heavily regulated, and their priorities often clash with the massive immediate needs of a hyperscaler. Utilities also have to balance things, right? They're mandated to balance booming data center demand with keeping residential power affordable. It's a conflict. Data center operators, they need absolute control, absolute security, absolute reliability, and they just can't guarantee that from the traditional grid right now.
So the answer is basically build your own private energy system, operate behind the meter. Can you give us an example? What's the blueprint look like?
Well, a really good case study is unfolding down in Texas with a company called Fermi Inc. They're building this huge multi-phase data center campus, and their plan: directly connect to the Transwestern natural gas pipeline by 2026. That connection targets 1 GW of capacity near term using gas-fired generation.
So locking in immediate power with gas.
Exactly. They lock down their immediate firm power using gas, but then they're also planning their long-term transition. They're aiming for something like 11 GW long-term, planning for 4 integrated nuclear reactors eventually. But that immediate pipeline connection, it bypasses the slow utility grid, secures that firm power now, and gives them control over their energy costs. That's the blueprint.
A vertically integrated energy solution, purpose-built for AI. And this aggressive market behavior, this focus on self-supply, it seems like it's now getting some explicit validation from policy signals, too.
That validation is really important for investors, yeah.
A key signal was language in a recent fact sheet indicating a potential move to eliminate certain subsidies for what were termed unreliable green energy sources, meaning standalone wind and solar without storage. Now, this isn't necessarily anti-renewables across the board, but it's definitely a policy pivot. It shifts the financial incentives away from generation that can't guarantee constant reliable power 2047, and that inherently strengthens the case for sources that can run all the time. Okay, but doesn't that sound a bit like policy picking winners? Effectively favoring one source over another? What's the take on the political risk of leaning so heavily on nat gas here?
It does highlight a kind of regulatory preference, yeah, but the argument is that it's born out of necessity right now. The sources emphasize this isn't really about ideology, it's about ensuring grid stability. So the policy mandate prioritizes dispatchable power sources plants you can turn on when needed, like gas, And they're also trying to actively accelerate infrastructure permitting, cut through some of the red tape. This official push to streamline things, it validates the market's current reliance on natural gas as that essential short-term bridge fuel. It's seen as necessary to maintain economic competitiveness in AI.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's translate this into investment themes for nat gas then. It seems like the sector offers two pretty different risk profiles. You got the midstream side, the pipelines, which sounds like the safer play, and then the upstream side, the producers, which sounds like more of a growth, high leverage play. Let's start with midstream, the plumbing.
Right. Midstream pipeline operators, they're widely seen as the safest bet in this energy space, mainly because they're essential infrastructure. Companies like Kinder Morgan, KMI, Williams Companies, W&B, TC Energy, TRP, they earn stable, pretty predictable revenue. How? They operate mostly on fixed fee contracts. Basically, they get paid based on the volume of gas they move through their pipes, not the price of the gas itself.
So even if the benchmark Henry Hub gas price crashes, they're okay as long as gas is flowing. They're like a toll road, essentially.
Exactly. That fixed fee model gives their cash flows a kind of infrastructure-like stability. It's largely decoupled from commodity price swings. And just to give a sense of scale, Kinder Morgan alone handles something like 40% of all U.S. natural gas production that moves through pipelines. They are the definition of a bottleneck solver.
Okay, and you mentioned tax simplicity, too. That seems important. KMI, WMB, TRP, they're C-Corp.
Yeah, and that's a crucial point for many investors, especially passive ones.
Mm-hmm.
These big names are C corporations. They issue a standard 1099 tax form at year-end.
Why is that such a big deal compared to, say, a K-1 form?
Well, a lot of other midstream companies are structured as master limited partnerships or MLPs, and MLPs issue what's called a Schedule K-1. The K-1 is just notoriously complex for individual investors. It often means you need specialized tax help. It can complicate state tax filings. It's just a headache for many. So for a lot of people, avoiding that K-1 headache makes a C Corp issuing a simple 1099 like Kinder Morgan structurally preferable, even if the yield might look slightly different on paper. Simplicity matters. It lowers the perceived risk.
Got it. Okay, now let's flip to the other side. The upstream producers, the companies actually drilling for the gas. This sounds higher risk, but maybe much higher reward because of this convergence thesis?
Exactly. This is the leveraged growth opportunity. It hinges on this core idea that rising inelastic AI demand plus the huge ramp up in liquefied natural gas LNG exports. That combination is set to quickly soak up the domestic supply glut that's historically kept U.S. natural gas prices, the Henry Hub price, artificially low compared to the rest of the world. This demand surge is expected to force U.S. prices to converge upwards, closer to international benchmarks like the European TTF or the Asian JKM.
And those international prices are much higher.
Oh yeah, they can be up to 4 times higher than what we typically see at Henry Hub.
So why have U.S. prices been so cheap for so long? Just oversupply?
Oversupply combined with insufficient physical infrastructure to get it all out. Specifically, not enough pipeline capacity and, critically, not enough LNG export terminal capacity to ship all that cheap domestic gas onto the global market. We produce way more than we can currently export. But as these massive new LNG export facilities come online over the next few years, and as this domestic AI demand starts sucking up local supply, that price gap, that arbitrage window, it really has to start closing.
Okay, so the potential upside for the producers could be huge if that domestic price rises towards global levels.
Precisely. Producers like, say, Range Resources, RRC, they're really well positioned for this potential leverage. Their break-even cost, the price they need to start making money on their reserves, is conservatively estimated below $2.50 Henry Hub. They're profitable even at today's relatively low prices. So if prices start moving towards global rates, RRC and peers like Antwerp Resources, AR, they could see massive leveraged upside because their cost base is so low compared to where the gas could potentially sell. Betting on upstream producers is essentially betting that this relentless demand growth will force that price gap to close.
Okay, that paints a clear picture for the near term. Nat gas is basically the required fuel for maybe the next 5, maybe more years. But as we know, natural gas is still a fossil fuel. It still emits carbon. So for the really long-term decarbonized 247 power solution, we have to shift to Section 2, nuclear energy. This seems like the ultimate endgame answer, but with big caveats.
Yeah, nuclear is, look, it's undeniably essential if you're talking about long-term viability for this kind of power demand. It's really the only non-fossil fuel source we have that can deliver that constant 2047 firm baseload power at the gigawatt scale that AI needs. Its reliability metrics are just unmatched by anything else that's zero carbon. Traditional nuclear plants, they operate continuously at incredibly high capacity factors, averaging around 92%.
92%. That's just,
Yeah.
it's staggering compared to intermittent sources like solar or wind, right?
Yeah.
Which might average, what, 25%, maybe 40% capacity factor, depending on location.
Exactly. And that highlights why nuclear is often described as being too dense and efficient to ignore. The energy density of the fuel itself means a tiny physical footprint can generate enormous amounts of reliable power. And critically, especially for tech companies aiming for net zero targets, it generates electricity without directly emitting CO2 during operation. Even when you look at the full life cycle construction, fuel, operation, its median emissions profile is actually comparable to wind and solar. So it's a really powerful, clean energy tool.
And the tech industry isn't just sitting back waiting for this. They're actively putting their money where their mouth is, underwriting nuclear power through long-term contracts, right? These PPAs.
Yeah, this financial validation from big tech is absolutely key. They're signing these long-term power purchase agreements, PPAs, contracts, often spanning 15, even 20 years. These PPAs lock in stable power costs for them, sure, but more importantly, they provide the financial certainty that nuclear operators need to keep existing plants running or even potentially plan for future life extensions or upgrades. A prime example is Microsoft buying power from the restarted Three Mile Island reactor TMI-1 through Constellation Energy, CEG.
Right. And we also saw Amazon make that big move, buying a data center campus strategically located right next door to the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that colocation trend, putting the massive demand right next to the massive supply, that's the ultimate proof point, isn't it? They're willing to pay a premium for that specific land because it basically eliminates enormous transmission risk and cost. If you're right next door, you potentially skip that decade-long wait for new high-voltage transmission lines and guarantee yourself firm power delivery directly from the source.
And this long-term nuclear vision, it's also embedded in U.S. national strategy now, particularly around AI.
Absolutely. If you look at documents like the America's AI Action Plan, it explicitly calls out the need to embrace nuclear fission and also things like advanced geothermal as strategic frontier energy technologies. So this policy support confirms that nuclear isn't just seen as like an optional green thing. It's viewed as a national security necessity for maintaining global leadership in the AI race. And the long-term vision definitely involves pushing forward with small modular reactors, SMRs. The hope is it'll allow for quicker, more decentralized deployment, maybe even right next to data center campuses, solving those transmission bottlenecks at the source.
Okay, SMRs sound great in theory, quicker, smaller, maybe factory-built, but we absolutely have to address the massive elephant in the room, the time-delay risk. Nuclear, especially building anything new, has just this terrible track record of delays and huge cost overruns. This feels like the single biggest execution hurdle.
It is. It's the single biggest risk factor, hands down. Nuclear's large-scale contribution. It's just not immediate. SMRs, despite all the promise, they're still probably a decade away from mass commercialization and actually proving their economics at scale. And the historical precedent for large builds is, well, it's terrifying for investors. You just have to look at the Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors in Georgia, finished 7 years late, and a staggering $18 billion over budget.
$18 billion over budget. And didn't we just see a major SMR project, the inelastic one, get canceled entirely because of cost blowouts? I mean, given that history, is it even responsible to talk about nuclear as a viable investment theme right now? How do the sources suggest mitigating that massive execution risk?
That's a very fair question. And the sources are careful to draw a sharp line between speculative new build projects and operational certainty. Yes, the recent cancellation of that inelastic SMR project in Utah is a huge warning sign. It shows that these first-of-a-kind advanced projects carry enormous cost escalation risk. Inelastic's estimated cost ballooned from around $3 billion to over $9 billion before they pulled the plug. So the argument from an investment perspective is avoid that construction risk if you can.
Okay, so if we sidestep the new construction risk, where do investors find opportunities in the nuclear space? Seems like two main themes emerge.
Right. First, you have the existing utilities and operators.
Yeah.
Companies like Constellation Energy, CEG, or Vistra, VST. These guys already own and operate existing nuclear power plants. They're the ones securing those very attractive long-term PPAs with the tech giants. They're essentially converting that guaranteed AI demand into multi-decade stable revenue streams with minimal speculative technology risk. That's the secured cash flow play.
Okay, that makes sense. Lower risk, steady income from existing assets. And the second theme, that's a much higher risk, but maybe with higher potential rewards. The fuel itself, uranium.
Correct. The uranium and fuel cycle play is a bet on structural commodity scarcity. There's this big global policy push, validated by things like the US AI plan, aiming to potentially triple nuclear capacity by 2050. But that rising demand is running headlong into a fundamental structural supply deficit for uranium. Current estimates point to a gap of maybe 400 million pounds of uncovered uranium needs globally just by 2030.
So simple supply and demand,
Right.
rising demand, constrained supply, pushing prices up. And this is amplified by geopolitics and financial factors.
Exactly. Geopolitically, you've got significant tension because Russia currently controls about 40% of the world's uranium enrichment capacity. That's a huge strategic vulnerability for the West. And then financially, you have vehicles like the SPROT, Physical Uranium Trust, SPUT. They are actively buying physical uranium in the spot market and just holding it, taking it off the market. They're effectively tightening the screws on utilities who have maybe historically waited too long to contract for their future fuel needs. All this creates what looks like a highly asymmetric risk-reward profile for the uranium commodity itself. The bet is that the price has to rise significantly to incentivize the difficult, long lead time process of bringing new mines online.
Okay, that lays out the long-term picture and its challenges. Now let's move to Section 3 and briefly touch on the roles of the other players. Renewables, oil, and coal in this AI-driven energy future. Starting with renewables, solar, and wind. What's their fundamental structural limitation when it comes to powering AI?
It's pretty simple, really. Intermittency. AI needs power constantly, 247 reliably. Firm power. Solar only works when the sun shines, wind only when the wind blows. They just cannot provide that necessary reliability on their own without absolutely massive utility-scale battery storage. And building out that battery storage capacity to cover gigawatt-hour needs, right now it's just too expensive, takes up too much space, and adds significant operational complexity. Scaling it fast enough is a huge challenge.
And beyond just generating the power, there's still a problem of getting it from, say, a remote, windy, plain, or sunny desert to the data centers, which are often closer to cities. That transmission bottleneck again.
Yeah, that infrastructure bottleneck is severe and honestly often underestimated. The whole system for approving and building new transmission is plagued by fragmentation, different priorities across states, and just massive permitting delays. If you look at the interconnection queues, the list of projects waiting to connect to the grid, the backlog is years long. Years. Building a major new high-voltage transmission line can easily take 8 years, maybe even a decade, even if the funding is there. This inability to actually move the power efficiently is a huge reason why the policy focus seems to be shifting. And add to that, some renewable energy sources are starting to lose certain federal tax benefits, which also shifts the financial momentum a bit towards more dispatchable sources.
So renewables aren't going away, obviously,
Yeah.
but their role or trajectory might be changing in this new landscape.
Absolutely. They're still crucial for decarbonization goals, but the future likely involves more hybrid solutions. That means renewables are integrated into the grid, yes, but they need to be firmly anchored or backed up by reliable, firm power sources like nuclear or maybe advanced geothermal eventually to guarantee that continuous 24/7 supply. The grid needs a solid backbone, and right now, intermittent sources alone just can't provide that backbone reliably enough for AI's needs.
Okay, now moving to oil. Obviously, oil isn't directly fueling data centers, but it sounds like it's an indirect beneficiary of this whole energy build-out. Where's the safest way to play that, especially considering capital expenditure?
Right. The oil market itself, it's facing its own structural issues. The high-growth U.S. shale era seems to be maturing, making big, capital-intensive drilling programs maybe less attractive than they once were. However, the AI boom does benefit oil indirectly. How? Through associated natural gas production, a lot of oil wells also produce gas, and through land plays. Probably the safest, lowest capex way to get exposure here is through royalty and land plays. These are companies like Texas Pacific Land, TPL, or the more recent IPO, LandBridge, LB. They essentially own vast tracts of land, often with mineral rights. They profit from royalties when oil and gas companies drill on their land. And importantly, they also profit from the booming water. Business water is crucial for oil production and also for cooling those massive data centers. And the key, they do all this with a very minimal capital expenditure, capex themselves. They're not drilling the wells.
So they just collect rent and royalties based on the volume, without taking the drilling risk. And it sounds like LandBridge is specifically targeting this AI trend.
Yeah, they are. LandBridge is actively marketing what they call powered land concepts. They're leveraging their huge land holdings and existing mineral rights, particularly in places like the Permian Basin, to basically create turnkey sites for data centers. Because they control the land, potentially the gas resource underneath, and the water rights, they can offer these highly desirable, maybe even pre-permitted locations. It lets them capture value from both the resource extraction and the industrial build-out happening on top.
Interesting. Okay, finally, let's quickly touch on coal. You wouldn't think coal has much of a future, but is it playing any role at all in this desperate search for reliable power right now?
Sadly, yes, just out of sheer necessity in some cases. The urgent need for baseload reliability, maybe even fear of blackouts in some areas, is actually causing some utilities to extend the operational lives of existing coal plants that they had previously planned to shut down.
Really? Just keeping old coal plants running longer?
It's seen as a temporary measure, a stopgap, but it highlights the level of urgency for reliable power right now. However, there's also a more innovative and frankly better strategy emerging, converting old, decommissioned coal plant sites to run on natural gas instead.
Okay, converting coal to gas. Why is that appealing? What makes it cost-effective?
The big advantage is cost savings. Estimates suggest it can save over 50% compared to building a brand new gas plant from the ground up. Why? Because you get to reuse a lot of the existing infrastructure. Critically, the existing high voltage transmission connections are already there. The land is already permitted for industrial use, which is huge, and often the large cooling water systems are still in place. So it allows utilities to bring reliable, dispatchable, gas-fired power online much more quickly and cheaply than starting from scratch, avoiding years of permitting battles for a new site.
That ties everything together nicely. Okay, let's try to synthesize all this in our outro and deliver a final verdict for listeners.
Yeah, I think the core thesis is pretty clear now. This AI boom, it's fundamentally an energy revolution. It creates this massive, inelastic demand for reliable 247 firm power. And that demand exposes these deep physical bottlenecks mainly, the slowness and inadequacy of the existing grid infrastructure. And it absolutely mandates huge targeted capital spending, but only in very specific areas.
Right. And the investment landscape, as we've laid out, seems defined by those three core solutions we focused on. Natural gas is the immediate bridge and the volume play. Existing nuclear is the high-value, secured cash flow play for long-term firm power. And uranium as that structural commodity scarcity play, betting on the fuel itself.
And I think our focus as investors has to stay rigidly fixed on the bottleneck solvers, on the companies that are mitigating execution risk. It's really about the picks and shovels, the companies physically moving the product, building the infrastructure, solving the logistical headaches rather than just betting solely on the high-flying tech companies themselves.
Okay, let's try to categorize the best plays by risk profile then, turning this analysis into something actionable. For an investor primarily seeking stability and income, maybe with minimal tax hassle.
I think you look squarely at those midstream natural gas C-Corp, companies like Kinder Morgan, KMI, or Williams Companies, WMB. They offer that stable, fixed-fee revenue, which largely insulates you from commodity price swings. And crucially, they give you that simple 1099 tax form protecting you from the K-1 complexity.
Okay, what about for the investor who's willing to take on significantly higher risk for the potential of truly asymmetric risk-reward?
That profile points towards the uranium and fuel cycle. You're making a direct bet on that structural supply deficit we discussed. The thesis is that the deficit must eventually resolve with much higher uranium prices. And that potential is amplified by the geopolitical situation and those financial tightening mechanisms like the SPROT Physical Uranium Trust, SPUT, or investing in major producers like Cameco. It's higher risk, higher potential reward.
Got it. And what about the opportunity that seems to have the most policy certainty behind it, and maybe the most secured growth with lower execution risk, particularly within the nuclear space?
Well, based on our discussion, that probably lies with the existing nuclear operators and utilities. Again, think Constellation Energy, CEG, or Vistra, VST. They are the ones locking in those long-term PPAs with the tech giants right now. They're effectively turning today's guaranteed AI demand into predictable, multi-decade revenue streams using assets that are already built and running. That minimizes the new build technology and execution risk.
And finally, for exposure to the sheer volume growth and infrastructure build-out, but without taking on the heavy capital expenditure burden of building things.
That points towards those capital-light infrastructure plays we mentioned, specifically the royalty and land plays like Texas Pacific Land, TPL, and Landbridge, LB. They profit from the huge industrial volumes of gas, of water, with minimal capex risk themselves. It offers a kind of structurally protected position that captures value from both the resources in the ground and the industrialization happening on the surface.
Okay. This analysis provides, I think, a pretty conclusive investment outlook.
Yeah.
The future energy mix isn't going to be some simple, clean switch. It looks like a mandated, probably quite messy convergence that heavily favors reliability and power density over pure intermittency, almost regardless of past policy preferences. So the verdict remains clear. Risk defined, portfolio protected.
And that leads us right into the final, maybe provocative thought we want to leave everyone mulling over. One that really connects this whole investment thesis back to the broader societal impact of this energy arms race.
Yeah, we established pretty clearly that the biggest, wealthiest energy consumers, the hyperscalers building out AI, they're actively constructing their own premium, private, behind-the-meter power grids. They're doing it to secure control, to guarantee reliability, effectively locking in the best, most reliable power for themselves.
So the question we should all be asking ourselves is this. If the AI giants are securing this premium power, often at guaranteed long-term rates, what are the long-term consequences for the price and the reliability of electricity for the average person, for the residential consumer, for small businesses, for everyone who has to rely on the traditional, often slow-moving, potentially underinvested public utility grid? Are we actually heading towards a kind of two-tiered energy system
Yeah.
where the private AI economy gets its premium resilient power supply, while the public grid potentially gets older, maybe less reliable, and almost certainly more expensive for everybody else?
That potential structural split between the secured power needs of the AI world and the potentially struggling public grid feels like the critical societal tension emerging from this energy revolution. Definitely something to think more about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.